Hey everybody, welcome to the supply chain bunker. We are seeing quite a lot of people just logging in now and getting everything loaded and online. So I'm just going to give everybody 20 or 30 seconds to get logged in, and then we'll start.
Hey Scott, is that a real bunker, by the way? That's what I wanted to know.
It is. I built one in my basement from when we
Nice.
talked last night, so I was inspired
Oh,
for you.
We'll
I
just,
put my war map up, and I got all the different things going. I got my phone. My phone's ready to go if I got to grab. But the bunkers was impressive overnight. That's some lean manufacturing.
Oh,
did you
absolutely.
3D print that, Scott?
Yes, well, we have a Mark Forged in the basement and a glow forge. So
Oh,
There you
cool.
go.
so
So the
put
glow
them away.
forge was etching and cutting away. The Mark Forge was laying down cement and carbon fiber. That's good. That's well reinforced.
It is
There you
a
go.
complete carbon fiber
So we're
bunker.
ready.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, let's get started. It's 3:30 in San Francisco, it's 6:30 in New York, and it's 9:30 a.m. on Friday morning here in Melbourne, Australia. Welcome to the Supply Chain Bunker. We've got Dave Evans, CEO of Fictiv, with us. Dave is the mastermind behind the Supply Chain Bunker, and we'll talk about that in a second. And Scott Miller is the CEO of Dragon Innovation and a partner of Bolt, which is I think a VC company. So we're in uncharted waters at the moment, guys. We need information, but not just headlines. We need information that comes from experience and insight and can help us find a way forward, a way to keep moving forward. Every part of our work and personal lives is seeing disruption. Collectively, we're starting to work from home. Our supply chains are disrupted. We're starting to see demand disruptions. Our communications have been disrupted. Everything's changed. What we need now more than ever, I think, is real information and real leadership. And before we start and go through the format of the Supply Chain Bunker, I want to just ask Dave to briefly share his inspiration for this project. And what we're kind of looking to achieve here and what we're looking to do. I know it's a very fluid
Yeah.
idea, and I'm sure it will develop organically. But what were you thinking, Dave?
For sure. And I think that this is really an organic conversation that's come out of many one-on-one discussions I've been having with other supply chain leaders across really the world. And so I think in the time where there's so much turmoil and folks are really nervous around what's going on politically in terms of COVID-19, in terms of businesses as a whole and financials, this concept or idea of, well, let's create a bunker or an area where all the best leaders' minds can get together and talk about all the different views and opinions that we're seeing. And so the thought of this series that we're going to run every week is to get experts to come in and talk about State of the Union, just like we would in any type of wartime. What's the newest information? How does it relate to supply chains? How should people think about actually adjusting or modifying their strategies in business? And so I hope that this becomes a place where we can stimulate conversation, make connections between different leaders, and really share perspective for how we drive the future of manufacturing and supply chain. And so we are lucky and privileged to have Scott here from Dragon to be our inaugural expert in residence. And, Phil and I will be co-hosting this every week to help drive the conversation and really shed some light on what we're seeing.
Yeah, and welcome, Scott. Really appreciate you being here. And actually, Dave and I had a number of conversations through the week, and it was who should we get for the inaugural guest? So, who knows their stuff, who's been living this process, and who's gonna build a 3D printed bunker in their basement
In
in
24 hours.
in
Yeah, pretty
24
good.
hours. And you were top of everybody's list, Scott. So we really appreciate you being there. What we're going to do each week is try and open up with some of the headlines and some of the experience that people are having personally, and then we're going to start to run through the numerous questions that came in at registration. And run through those as topics and explore some different ideas. And I just wanted to share a couple of examples, or an example today of something good we've seen technology doing. And I think it's important that we do that, because a lot of what we're seeing in the news isn't very cheery at the moment. And there was a great piece in the news, and I'll happily share this through LinkedIn or whatever platform's easiest. But there was a great example this week of an Italian 3D print company whose local hospital ran out of
printing the valves. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, valves needed for an aspiration machine. And the guy rocked up with his 3D printer. Within a couple of hours, they'd scanned the part and built a CAD file. And they were printing these parts, and they were in use within 2 or 3 hours. And I think that's just a great example of, when the supply chain's broken, sometimes there's a fix. And I've always, for the last 5 years, I've been watching 3D printing and excited about some of the things it can do in terms of making life better. And I was talking to Scott before, I was at an event last year with a panel from the healthcare industry talking about 3D printing, and the guy's vision was absolutely a 3D printer in every hospital, and in some cases several, maybe a 3D printer in theater and those kind of things, not just for these cases where you need something very quickly, but also when you need something customized and focused for a very specific patient need. So I would encourage everybody to, when they come into the bunker, to try and bring a good news story in, as well as all the challenges and all the tales of woe. I think that's hugely important.
And Dave, I think I also want to help share that the purpose of the bunker is to have participation. So for all the folks that logged in, and it's great to see the numbers just continuing to trickle in, we want this to be a conversation. Use the Q&A section, use the chat that's in Zoom here. You can just find it at the bottom of your screen and ask a conversation. The purpose of this is, listen, we're all locked in at home, or we're working in a remote office somewhere. And so the purpose of a bunker is to get all of the thoughts into a centralized place, so people are sharing the intelligence across many different regions across the world. And Stephen, if you think about the panelists, we have folks in Australia, San Francisco, and Boston for our inaugural kickoff. And so we really want folks to ask questions and engage here. And so the format that we're going to share is that as co-hosts, Phil and I are going to give a bit of a state of the union, things that we see going on in the world and ecosystem right now. And then we're going to have Scott come in, and we'll have a pretty good panel conversation around some of his expertise, with questions. So please don't be shy. Oh, there's the first one. I love it. And please ask questions away. So excited to kick off. So go ahead, Phil.
Yeah. And, when I look at the biggest shift that I've seen in the last week, we did a webinar last week with Jean Oliveri, the COO of Fictiv, and Ron Keith from Supply Chain Resource Group. And it was a great webinar, a huge amount of registration and engagement. And there was a lot of discussion there about disruption in China. I think we've shifted very, very rapidly to that being a much more global issue. So there's much more disruption going on outside of China now. And I think that's where we're seeing some challenges. I've seen press releases come across my desk over the last few days from large EMS companies saying they've closed a particular factory here, or in the US, or in Central Europe. So there are all kinds of new challenges coming on, and that kind of agility is becoming more and more important. Let's bring Scott in on the conversation. Scott, give us a quick introduction of yourself. I know you've got a huge background in manufacturing, and a quick introduction to Dragon Innovation. And then we can talk a bit about what you've been seeing over the last couple of months and how you've been dealing with that for your customers.
Sure. And, thank you so much for hosting this bunker. I think it's incredibly important in general, but in particular during these times. And I'll talk about Dragon in a sec, but one of the things that I love is just how, with this challenge we're all facing on a global basis, people have really come together. And it could have gone in any direction, but I think in many ways this is bringing out the best of people. And what you're doing here is a good example of that. I was, just doing my work this afternoon, and John Hirschtick, the founder of SolidWorks and Onshape, called me up, and it's like, hey, Scott, we're working to create masks for Brigham and Women's Hospital to protect the health workers. basically using, you might have seen the cool snorkeling mask with the snorkel out the back, the full face mask. So they're trying to 3D print just an attachment that will hold the filter, but they needed a filter expert. And they're like, you used to work at iRobot and you do a lot of sourcing.
Tell me about it.
So I'm like, yeah. So I called up Colin, the
Fantastic.
CEO of iRobot, and said, hey, Colin, this is what we're trying to do. Can you help? And he's like, I'm on it. So he was calling the iRobot sourcing team in China. And then I was also able to grab my friend DJ, who did the design for a bunch of HEPA filters. But it's just really great that it really, in trying to find the silver lining, that it brings us all together and to solve a common problem.
So, have you seen Scott, all the open source work that's going on around some of the different like respirators and thinking about ventilators and these kind of things as well?
Yes. Yeah, we sent a letter out last night, just letting our customers know what's happening and the broader community. And the inrush has been amazing with people sharing what they're doing. So there's so many different facets of this, but everybody, I think, is just really diving in and sharing what skill they have.
I think it's amazing. I've been tracking a lot, and so it's folks from the maker community, but it's international as well. It's seeing people from China and Taiwan and Japan and US and Ireland, like all of this global community coming together. And so it's times like these, I think, have so much, you reflect on humanity's good and how we all help each other, which is so great.
Yeah, I think that sense of community is huge. And actually, that's a good time just to bring in a question that came in from the audience already as they logged on to the event. And that was, how realistic are expectations of global OEMs to switch up manufacturing to help? It's kind of it's that war footing, isn't it? It's that, how do we switch from making this to making medical equipment and supplies? And I know the government has shaken up the whole FDA approval process and kind of accelerated that. How do you see that filtering through to actual real examples?
I mean, in my experience, and again, we're sort of experiencing this real time, but it's the biggest challenge, I think, is getting the leadership in place. Like, everybody wants to help. I think we've turned the corner realizing, like, wow, this is a big deal. We're all hunkered down in our own home bunkers. So we're now like embracing, like, something needs to be done and leaders are stepping up. But like with any good team, we've got to have some sort of an organization. We don't want it to be like a third grade soccer match where everybody comes around the ball.
Chasing the ball around, yep.
Yeah, we need to get more like the Patriots used to be, at least New England fan. Maybe picking something controversial, but a little bit.
I said the 49ers, that's what you said, right?
Well, Jimmy was a good Pat back in the day.
Fair enough.
But yeah, so I think we're now like, we got to do something. And then the next challenge ahead of us is, how do we organize to go through it efficiently? Because I don't think we have a lot of time. It's spreading pretty quickly. So there is some importance to acting with.
Yeah, I think
from my perspective on the automotive, because I came from Ford prior to this.
Yeah.
What's really challenging in automotive is that so many different companies, OEMs, are reliant on the same suppliers. And this is true from a cost perspective, but also from a supply chain reliance. And so if you look back in 2008 as like the last like major recession in the United States, the most classic example is if you look at Ford. And Alan Mulally was the CEO of Ford at the time. And he went in front of Congress and was talking around, hey, should the government truly bail out Ford or not? And if you remember at this time, we saw all of these different OEMs starting to go bankrupt and file for it. And what was really remarkable at the time that Alan said was, he went in front of the Congress and said, hey, if you don't bail all of us out, and I mean my competitors, I'm talking Chrysler, I'm talking GM, Ford is going to fold as well. Because when I buy a seat, I'm not the only one that manufacturer is building a seat for. They're building seats for everyone. And so when you look at supply chains, and a lot of folks want to talk about agility and what are the expectations we might see in the infrastructure shifting, I think that a lot of people forget about the bullwhip effect and this idea of these different suppliers down at the chain, basically the tier ones, the twos, that they're really all interconnect together. And so being able to step back, and the news loves to talk about a Ford, a GM, a Tesla today,
Yeah.
but really it's tiered ones and twos in supply chain. And even the threes, like these mom and pops, that's where the infrastructure is the most volatile. And I think the least amount of visibility. And so when we advise a lot of companies on that supply chain, like, how do you think about your full stack of supply that you're using is really important.
Yeah, and that's where, maybe that's where the most assistance can be cranked up as well. It's not necessarily a Ford production line that's going to be able to switch over to something else, but it's maybe one of those tier one suppliers, a Continental or a Bosch or whoever that's got a much broader manufacturing footprint and a much broader set of manufacturing resources that can come in and help. What I also wanted to say there is, wouldn't it be great if, as a result of being in the bunker and discussing some of these things, people did actually reach out directly? And I would encourage them to do that to both Dave and I, but I guess to the panelists that we have on here through LinkedIn, and say, hey, I'm having a problem with this. Can you guys help out? Because what I'm seeing is people kind of coming together around particular problems and trying to create solutions. Scott, I'm going to ask you to do a quick introduction to Dragon Innovation again. And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask Krista if she can put up our first poll. So that's on the screen while you're doing that.
Yeah, sorry, I got so excited about the other stuff. I failed on the Dragon intro. So yeah, for Dragon, we got our experience, many of us working at iRobot for 10 years, at least in my case, leading the team that built the first 4 million Roombas. And what we saw is in 2009, the last recession as it was, that a lot of engineers had time on their hands and were coming up with these great ideas. And they were very strong in going from an idea to a prototype, but they really just didn't know how to scale. And because we'd lived that and made pretty much every mistake the hard way and then figured out how to fix it, we thought there was an opportunity to help. And that was our impetus for starting Dragon. So we really focus, once a customer has a prototype they can plunk on the table and might want to build 5,000 to 5 million, helping them figure out, how do you do design for manufacturing assembly? How do you pick a factory? And then how do you manage that whole MPI process?
Yeah, and Scott, where have you seen, you think Dragon be the most helpful? Is it in the strategy side? Is it boots on the ground? Like how do folks kind of interact with Dragon usually?
Sure. So we work across the whole spectrum. In many cases, I'll work with the CEOs of small companies to large companies, helping them think about more of the strategic levels. And then we've got a great team in China, Taiwan, domestically in Seattle and Boston, and then also over in Europe, to be able to help with both strategic thinking, but also, the boots on the ground, which as it comes to China is more and more important these days, I think, than ever before.
Yeah. Guys, we've just got the poll results in, and unsurprisingly, more than half of those, well, 2/3 of those that responded are seeing an impact, some very much so. Not yet, thankfully, is a sentiment we share, and congratulations to that 36% that are in that position. But I would suggest,
but you should be concerned.
Well, I suggest the not yet is the most important part of that, and that kind of brings me to my question for Scott, which is, we kind of went into Chinese New Year with predictable disruption. We came out with an unpredictable disruption that we thought was very specific to a region. And now we're going into the stage of a global disruption. How's that been for you and your clients? And I know this is a big question, but what have you been doing over that period, and what's the impact been?
Yeah, so, I think you framed it right. We all knew Chinese New Year was happening. Sometimes it's a surprise every year, but it is on the calendar. So we had been working with our customers to plan for it. And I think the hardware community in general had done that. It just effectively lasted a lot longer than anybody anticipated. And there's certainly most of the factories, if not all, shut down for several weeks after CNY. We're starting to see them now pretty much fully open. I'd say for the factories we work with at Dragon, we're back to about 90% capacity, which is great. And for our team of 15 people over there, they can travel to the factory and provide on the ground support. One of the big challenges, though, is that it's not really possible to travel into China if you're on the outside. And one of the core tenets at Dragon is communication is absolutely the most important thing. If you can streamline communication, then everything else is going to fall in place. And this has thrown a huge wrench in the works there. So thinking about, if you wanted to pick a factory, you've got to go and visit the factory with your own 2 feet and look with your eyes. And now that's not really possible. So that, complicates things considerably.
Yeah.
Where we're going to see some of the biggest impact is for the companies launching new products. Generally in consumer electronics, you need to have your product on the shelf the day after Thanksgiving. So at this point, you're picking factories, handing over the design and starting tooling. And all of that has been delayed. So every schedule, I think, is going to be incredibly pressurized. And we may not feel it right now, but come August, September, all of that stuff is going to start adding up. And then that's where the real pinch is going to start to take on.
Yeah, we're going to have some real compression around Q3 and Q4 as activities and events get pushed out of Q3. Any specific examples, Scott, with your customers, and Dave, the same from your point of view, examples of where, because you've got this transparency, because you've got this communication, because you guys have both got boots on the ground, you've been able to mitigate some of these problems and get things moving quickly in maybe moving it to another geography, and then how's that going to change going forward?
Yeah, so we haven't moved any of the manufacturing to different geographies, and actually China is looking better than before, given it's back online again. What we find is it's very hard once you've picked a factory partner to be able to make a change midstream. Potentially you've cut your tooling, and that's always harder to move than it ought to be. You've got the domain knowledge built up and also the relationships. So if we can try to make it work where it is. The biggest problem our customers have seen, and this is for ones that are currently producing at relatively high volume, is just a lack of parts. So if you're missing a component, generally you can't build the product. You need all of the parts. And we've been able to help just by doing simple things like getting on the phone and talking to the suppliers and working with them to get the parts delivered. That's one key part. And then the second key part is you need the workers available in the factories to actually put together the part. Most of what we do is not robotic automation these days. It's still very manual.
Yeah, it's still manual.
So if you don't have the workers, you can't build the product.
And I think what Scott's talking about is the exact reason for why we built Fictiv, is really to help apply agility in those types of needs where it tends to be a part which is holding up the entire assembly of the FATP. And what happens is that it's really hard that supply chain folks are planners, right? Everyone here that's walking is like, they already know Christmas is going to be the hardest Christmas, and we're sitting here in March, And so for us, what we think about is, how do you apply agility within this ecosystem so that as you have disruptions in supply chain, you're able to move different geographies? And so for us, what we saw is that we saw the calendar. Thank you, Scott, that Chinese New Year was still on there. But in January, we saw in China that COVID was going to hit us hard, that coming back, that factories were going to be 2 weeks at a minimum, if not outwards of 8 weeks slower to get back up to full ramp. And so for us as a manufacturing platform, able to actually move supply chain around. So we brought up Mumbai in India, we brought up Taiwan, and actually we saw a lot of component level manufacturing reshore and move back to the US during that time when China was longer, almost 15% actually of production moved out of China to other geographies. What's interesting now is in kind of the third week of March, the US seeing a lot of production delays, that suppliers like in the Bay Area aren't even able to open up. Even Tesla is getting, shut down, trying to stay online. But what we're seeing now is that 15% that shifted actually is moving back to China, because as Scott said, most factories are back up to around 90%. And so what I would push a lot of the supply chain leaders that are listening right now to think about is, what's your plan B and C? everyone has a plan A. Everyone's saying, here's where I'm going to do FATP, my final assembly test package. And you're thinking about, here's where I'm sourcing, and I have a dual sourcing strategy on specific line items. But building those plan B and C, even if they are contingency, and having clear triggers for when you move to those, that's one of the biggest things I'm advising companies on in Fictiv today is how do you build strong contingency plans into your supply chain? We're receiving a lot of questions like that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when I look at that supply chain, and earlier you mentioned the different tiers and the different levels of the supply chain. And Scott, you mentioned, one part missing and you're holding up all the other manufacturing. I'm curious, when you both look at the supply chains that you've been operating in for the last couple of months, which ones have been the most robust? And what I'm expecting you to say is those that are digitally enabled, those that have that radical transparency, that have that level of traceability where you can drill down and you can see that immediately and you can say, hey, if this geography is being impacted or this supplier is being impacted, these are all the jobs it's going to trickle up to, and these are all the jobs that it's going to affect. What stood up as to make you say, hey, well, we didn't necessarily design for COVID-19, but we designed for disruption, and this has stood up to it.
Yeah, so the foundation there is, as you mentioned, Phil, is transparency. You've got to know not only who is doing your final assembly and test, but what are the vendors that are providing them the parts, and then what are their vendors. I know when I was running the Roomba team, we used to buy 12 million battery cells a year to put into the packs. And those have to come from somewhere. So you'd go to the battery vendor, and then they have to get the chemicals and the nickel and so on to actually build the batteries. It has to come from somewhere. And these are all things that are just sort of good supply chain hygiene in the first place to do when you're not under pressure, but to go and create really a thorough map of all of your vendors with contact information. And then you can figure out, are there basically long poles in the tent that if this one vendor goes down, and maybe it's your paint vendor, for some reason you're using some infrared blocking paint that's important, that's going to shut down everything. And then you start building out that area with redundancy, whether it's an approved vendor list or diversifying to different geographic regions if you can. What you want to avoid doing is boiling the ocean, because it's so hard, even in good conditions, just to build the product in the first place, that every supplier, you can't have like 5 different suppliers, an approved vendor list of 5.
There was a single source manufacturer that I think a whole bunch of the car manufacturers were using recently for a material in a particular group of paint colors. And it's basically taken that paint color out of the choice of dozens of brands of cars. And that's not an example that we need to be particularly worried about, because you can have a different color, but it's an example of how there's a lack of redundancy at some points in global supply chains.
Yeah, I think that, so I was chatting with a good friend that's at MIT Sloan. So he's on the supply chain and operations side of the business school over there. And, we were talking around this idea that in 19, we saw tariffs just, completely disrupt supply chains. And if you go back to 2011, you can look at earthquakes that happened in Japan and what that did in the automotive industry. And so this idea that every pandemic or force majeure or global trade causes disruption in supply chains. And the only thing to be true is that every disruption is unique, that it's really hard to say, here's a blanket plan to how you're able to mitigate risk. But what he shared with me, which I loved, was a simple framework that he said, it's all around prevention, detection, and response. And so no matter what goes on, a global trade, a force majeure, a pandemic, have plans that are, what's your prevention plan? How are you going to detect it when it happens? And how will you respond? And if you just think of this simple kind of 3-column matrix where in all of your list of items, you have a prevention, detection, response plan, it's a really simple tool that I love to say, hey, how would you apply that? And so the mechanical engineer in me would call it an FMEA, a failure modes and effect analysis, right? But from a supply chain side, I would push to our audience in this bunker to think about this prevention, detection, and response framework is a good way to think about it.
Yeah, I'm interested how you think as a software engineer as well, Dave, and we'll come to that. But I think what you said there really identifies that need for having not just a plan B, but having a plan C, because we are in this, this hugely unpredictable state. And that ability to see exactly how, how much trouble you're in very, very quickly is going to give you the agility to kind of create a new solution and create a
Yeah.
plan.
I mean, I think there's a number of factors there, and I'm curious Scott's opinion on this, but if you look at, the global financial markets, and if you think about as the US moves into a recession, or, a lot of folks at Goldman Sachs and people are pointing towards this, there's different industries that are going to be hit hard, and there's different industries that will actually prosper from this. Medical is a great example. We're seeing ventilators, respirators, all the stimulus that's going to get pushed from an innovation standpoint. But we'll have other scenarios, like if you look at airlines, or if you think about hospitality,
Yeah.
or if you think about places where consumers have discretionary spend. These are parts of the industry that will really feel, I think, a lot of disruption. And so, there's a question that came in to the panelists on, will we see a shift back to the US in some ways, or this concept of reshoring? I think in some scenarios, you might actually see it because lead time becomes more important in a specific industry. So like in a pandemic scenario, if ventilators is the shortage, a reshore to shorten lead time, even if costs increase, that might be a really strong factor for what your response is to that.
Yeah, I think
But
that's true.
you go ahead.
Sorry, Dave. I think that's true in every single supply chain. And, when we look at the retail supply chain right now in Australia, we're just about closing air routes into the country. And, we'll get some products externally, but because we're isolated, we're pretty much dependent on imports. So,
Yeah.
We're perhaps shifting to a point, whether it's temporary or not, where supply chains have to be shorter, and we have to kind of, it's a bit of a Luddite world where we go back to, can we get this produce locally? Can we get it from a local farm, and that kind of thing? And supply chains are just changing. And I suspect that the world won't return after this in the same way that it went in. So, in terms of supply chains, in terms of manufacturing, I think people are rethinking that. And I think there's been, with tariffs and trade wars, pressure from elsewhere on China anyway. Scott, what's your view on the way supply chains are changing and how they'll bounce back?
Yeah, so we've always been a huge supporter of building locally if possible. And it's often in the old days, meaning before January 21st or so, a function of volume, that if you can afford to build it onshore and the capability exists, that's what you should do. It's just easier to communicate with somebody in the same time zone language that you can drive to, rather than getting on a plane. I think now people are like, this is clearly a black swan event that nobody anticipated, but it has, profound consequences. And in my experience launching products, again, usually you're working so hard just to get the thing simply to launch that you don't have cycles to go and test the robustness of your supply chain. And I think that's absolutely going to change, that people are going to carve out more time to get to know the vendors and sub vendors and their vendors and understand this. And that's clearly net positive, as well as looking closer to home if they can. Because right now travel across international borders is a real challenge.
Yeah. So we've got kind of two different paths there. We've got the urgent and the important, and sometimes the urgent has to take priority over the important. But the important is, creating a supply chain that's, resilient in the future, and is going to be even more capable of dealing with these challenges.
I think something that's changed, though, that's interesting is if you think about, in the US, the recession in 08, 09, that when there was a huge disruption to supply chain, then the biggest difference between that period and now, and Scott, I'm sure you have perspective here, is that the China's GDP is so much larger today, a decade later, than it was back then. And so the reliance on China, it's like, even if you want to build and assemble locally, I agree that same time zone's easier. you are still reliant on China for some portion of your supply chain, regardless. Like your screws are going to come from there, your, epoxy that you use, or there's going to be some portion, because that GDP has grown so much in China that you have to think on a global scale. That I think even if you are going to reshore, to do your final assembly, which makes sense for a whole number of reasons, and I plus one or plus 1,000, Scott, to that strategy. I think that it's never been more important to think globally across the different tiers of suppliers.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we see all the time companies that have these hybrid supply chains where they probably do, for smaller volumes, the assembly and testing here, but they're bringing in, plastic parts from China and boards from Mexico and so on. So they're much, much more complex supply chains. And I think it gets to one of the key tenets here is that the more you can simplify the supply chain, the better off you're going to be. And again, that starts with first understanding it. But then once you understand it, if you have fewer parts, there's just fewer stuff to run out of. And it, less POs to issue, fewer partners to deal with.
Simplify.
Yeah, which is easier, of course, said than done. But it does merit a little work up front, as we say, cast a really long shadow. And it's those early decisions that you got to get right. And you don't always know that they're so important when you're making them, but they may come and bite you later.
9 months later.
Yeah. Supply chains are complicated and complex. There's a lot of moving parts. And that kind of brings me back to that previous question, Dave, about software. What's software's role in this? Is software able to, were you leveraging software heavily to get a clear picture of what you needed to do during this crisis?
Yeah, listen, the point is not to be self-promotional and talking about Fictiv, but I think that the idea is within supply chain, we are too reliant on people today, period. Is that, Scott mentioned all these things, how do you build different plans, and communication being number one. But primarily the way that we communicate today is this: we do Zoom, Skype, Excel, PowerPoints. These are generic business tools that really aren't fit for the complexity of building Roomba, right? Or building a Model 3 Tesla, or, let alone trying to build a rocket to send supplies to the ISS or something. So what I think about software's role in supply chain is to automate the tasks that primarily people do. And so if you're able to leverage software to issue POs, to track order and drive transparency, to do DFM, quoting, NPI work, all the way to the strategic sourcing, BOM management. Dragon is one of the best experts at cash flow analysis and how the needs for that. I'm like, cash is a big part of building hardware. These are areas that software, I think, really excels. And so for us as a manufacturing ecosystem is how we think about it. We really want to apply software to places that can automate or scale where humans are doing a lot of heavy lifting. So we've invested in quoting and lead time, in logistics and supply chain management, strategic sourcing, as well as on computational geometry analysis. So looking at files to optimize where they get made, how they get made, and the communication aspect. And I think the result of that is we're able to shorten a lot of the time it takes to do tasks that primarily people would have waited, days, weeks, months for. And that's what I think drives agility. So that's software's role in this. And I would love more thought leadership from everyone that's listening of where else can software help, and what should we be thinking about in the bunker around the best ideas around software.
Yeah, and it's no time to be interrogating spreadsheets, trying to find that common supplier.
But we all are.
Absolutely, you've got to be able to get to that really quickly. Scott, how have you been using, software? How important has that been in terms of being able to quantify and being able to manage the situation?
Yeah, so I love what Dave and the Fictiv team are doing. I think that's definitely going in the right direction. It's amazing to me, though, how this technology, which is pretty straightforward in different areas, like even just building software itself, has lagged in manufacturing. So there's still a ridiculous amount of Google Sheets, which of course you can't see in China, Excel going back and forth where you're not sure what version you have.
But you can use OneDrive to sync things, you know, with Excel.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, yeah.
blows my mind. One company I love is Onshape. So I think they've done a wonderful job of just putting CAD in the cloud.
Yep.
So you always have the right version. I can't remember, we've screwed up so many times back in the earlier days of not knowing whether
Version
it's building
control.
version 1 or like we'd have, this is final part or final
Yeah.
part 2, or this is really, really, really the final part.
Final. You know, the file name says V2, final, Scott approved,
Yeah.
final. That's
And,
fine, right?
Yeah.
yeah, and it's so true. That stuff happens.
I think we could have a whole webinar series entitled "Spreadsheet Horror Stories," because I think that's true of not just the manufacturing and supply chain, but every
company I've
other.
been talking to a little bit is called allspice.io, and they're early stage company, but working on just simply diffing your schematics.
Cool.
So if somebody makes a change, you can figure out what it is more simply. So a simple, like beautiful concept, but stuff like that is just not as prevalent as one might think.
Well, I can tell you that the mechies, the mechanical engineers, are probably the most people to blame of using like file names and version control in file names, primarily because diffs are so hard that, you know, what Onshape really did solve is the ability to do better version control management without heavy like PLM systems, you know, checking in things. And so there's so much need. And I think it goes back to what you said earlier, Scott, that it's all around communication, you know, and if there's anything that in a time of crisis right now, it's saying, how do you ensure communication is crisp, that we are all like moving to the same beat of the drum.
Yeah. I wanted to just, sorry, go ahead.
Say like once, you know, when you're under pressure, never one thing goes wrong, but it's typically many things go wrong at the same time. And they're all, you know, usually relatively small, but the additive effect can be catastrophic. So, you know, just
can you see my post-it notes up here, Scott? Look at all my post-it notes. You know, it's like
that's where
these
we
are all the things we're managing.
Yeah, it's moving a huge amount of moving parts. I just wanted to bring the audience back in, and I've got a question here from a fellow Forbes columnist. At a high level, what do you think are the top strategies, tips, tools, practices enabling a more robust supply chain? And you know, the background to that is in the last 2 years, but particularly with recent COVID-19 issues, there have been part shortages, tariffs, but now there's the renewed focus on geopolitical activities. So what are kind of our top strategies, tips, and tools?
Scott, you want to go first, and I'll go after you?
Sure. So one of the things we've been building out for many years is what we call the CM database, which is literally just a database of, in our case, about 1,000 different contract manufacturers and suppliers. And by having this information and all of their contact info and their expertise and strengths and weaknesses ahead of time in one place, it makes it a lot easier to connect the dots when we do create supply chains for our customers, so that when things hit the fan, we're not scrambling to go and, you know, try to figure this out after the fact. So I think the prior planning prevents poor performance really holds true, but investing some cycles into kind of laying that foundation ahead of time. And for us, it's custom software we built, but it's not rocket science. It's more the data that's important, or it's 100% the data that's important that's in there.
Yeah, it's that ability to interrogate the information that's in all kinds of different places and put it in one place. So that database, I guess that database has been a hugely important resource for you over the last few weeks.
Yes.
I think for me, from a macro, I'll go back to what I was saying of the prevention, detection, and response, is that, you know, create a simple framework. I think that one works really well. And then you want to build your contingency plans on, you know, how you're going to be able to how do you prevent it from ever happening, right? How do you prevent from having a shortage of screws at the end of the line when assembly? And then how will you actually be able to detect that? You don't want to detect it when the person at the end of the line raises their hand and said, I don't have screws. You want to be able to detect it earlier. And then when that bin that you detected at the loading dock doesn't show up, what's your response in that moment? And so I think doing that is something that I think people underinvest in or just don't think about, because you're just trying to get the product to market. You're just trying to launch it. I'm a big fan of visuals. And so literally it's like, can you build a physical map of this? Like put the sticky notes up on a wall, build a
Spoken like an
bunker.
engineer.
Yeah, build a bunker where you're actually going through all these different scenario plans. And then there's a variety of tools out there, you know, like the software Scott's talking about of, do you have a database of all your CMs and what they're good at, and a tier 1 and 2 and a backup? Do you, you know, can you leverage companies like a Fictiv, or, you know, like a Onshape, or like a Macrofab, or whoever, that do all these different parts of a supply chain to help out? But I think that the highest level for a macro, that what I can't stress enough to our companies is, we need to treat today as the new normal.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that, you know, don't think back to pre-COVID or pre-tariffs in 2019. It's like, we should look at the patterns that it's like every year or every couple of years, we're seeing more disruption happen at the macro level, whether it's global trade, it's pandemics, it's, you know, these things that cause massive economic and supply disruptions. So how do you get comfortable of living in this as the new norm? And, you know, if we could stress that to all the bunker representatives in here right now, I think that we'd be in a better place across all of our companies for how we bring products to market, which is what I just want to stress for sure. But great question. Thank you.
So top of mind really is visibility, and that's hugely valuable. And whether that's through well, no, it has to be through software. It has to be interrogatable, traceability. You have to be able to dig down, and ideally you want to be able to model scenarios, because, you know, having said this is the new norm, this will shift again in 12 months time, 2 years time, because something else will happen. And actually the norm post COVID-19, I don't think is going to be the same as the pre-COVID-19 norm. Hey, were you guys due to fly to Austin this week?
Yeah, we were supposed to do this in person. There was a favorite bar. You get a pineapple, they carve it out, you drink out of a straw, you know, in Austin, and we were just going to be there hanging out, I think, right?
Yes. So bummed. That would have been awesome.
I think in all seriousness, while you were there, you guys were going to be doing a panel as well on sustainability. And I know we're already planning to get you guys online to do that. And I think, you know, that's kind of, from my point of view as a journalist and a marketeer, one of the things that we're doing is looking at a world without trade shows. So norms are completely shifting in, you know, in kind of all different factors of our life. But I think when you look at that sustainable argument and you look at everything you would need to create a sustainable supply chain, it feels like there's a lot of similarities. You need that data, you need that visibility, you need to not get things wrong, because every time you get things wrong, you're creating waste. So this agility and sustainability are really tied closely together, Scott.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And, you know, the effort it takes to go map out your supply chain, while you're in there, you can do a sustainability analysis, you know, looking at simply how transparent are they, where do they source their materials, how do they take care of their workers, what's their carbon footprint. But yeah, it's, you know, goes hand in hand with protecting against these massive unforeseen occurrences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how have you worked, Scott, you know, in the past with kind of different companies on these strategies? Like, is this all part of kind of how you think about the engagement model and helping people think through everything from, you know, tariff strategies to sustainability and that kind of thing?
Yeah, this is all part of our standard project management,
Cool.
Especially for companies. We build around the world and don't care where our customers build as long as they succeed. But we do, that said, do a lot of production in China. And I think one thing that this is going to do for us is have us expose this work more and more to the customer. In general, we would, you know, manage it internally, but now I think it's critical that, you know, everybody has access to it and a good look. And I'm glad we're talking about sustainability, which is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah.
So that you know, it goes hand in hand with that.
I think what's also interesting when we look at the sustainability issue, and it plays to a couple of the questions we've been asked about lean manufacturing, because when we think of lean and green, they're quite connected. And when we want a sustainable and a lean supply chain, we tend to want less stock, we tend to want a shorter AVL list, we want all of those things. And at the moment, it feels like some of that desire to lean everything out and to go to a just-in-time strategy is potentially shooting us in the foot. What do you think about that? Are people's views on, you know, contingency stock and those kind of things going to change? We went from a tech wreck in 2000 where we had a ridiculous overhang of stock to a situation now where actually supply chains are pretty lean and maybe they're less robust as a result.
Yeah, I think, or what I'd love to see happen is that companies become more thoughtful. And for me, manufacturing is about communication and risk management. And, you know, you're never going to get to zero risk, but as you look at your supply chain and realize that maybe there's a couple critical suppliers that are single source, maybe you build up a little bit more safety stock there, do a bigger safety buy, which will tie up some cash. And, you know, if you have a design change, you're probably going to be scrapping that material because it's non-cancelable, non-returnable. But if there is a disturbance, you should be able to weather it a little bit more. So that every situation is unique, but what I'd love to see is just having that conversation with the operations team saying, okay, you know, we think we're good here. This is pretty agile. We can get it from a lot of different spots. This one I don't feel so good about. So let's be a little bit more robust, or, you know, be a little bit stronger in this area. But again, I think it's important not to boil the ocean, because in our world, there's cost, quality, and schedule. And if you try to do everything, you're going to end up doing nothing. So it's being selective.
Yeah. Is that a question of balance and, again, visibility, Dave? You've got to balance those things, and you've got to be able to model and see what's going on.
Well, I'm going to lean on Scott as the expert for this one for sure, but I think you always are trying to juggle speed, quality, price, right? You know, and so what's most important, and in different time periods of different companies, there's a different set of risk factors for those three items. And so I think Scott said it the best of how do you think about navigating across those. In some areas, you're going to spend more money. That's a cost. You're going to risk buy, so you have more buffer inventory to ensure that you don't have scheduled delays. That comes at some risk. And so really building like this triangle, or, you know, or the matrix for how you decide between those, I think is critical. Yeah,
and it is a balance. And, you know, you've got to have the tools, I guess, Scott, to be, and, you know, Dave mentioned that you support that kind of modeling of cash flow, particularly with a startup situation, and that's hugely important. But do people understand that risk and cost analysis, and do people understand, and again, questions from the audience in that area, the total cost of ownership of actually having a product or even a part come from a very specific location when you look at all those different factors?
Yeah, maybe Scott, you can talk a bit about the kind of total cost model and the cash flow a little. I think it's a really important topic that most companies overlook, you know, from a cash flow. And what, you know, any recommendations for how you would have companies think about that, especially now in this time?
Sure, yeah. So cash flow is often the hidden killer for hardware companies. And the challenge is that you can imagine one scenario where, say, you have to pay your factory 70% of the cost of the product when they order the parts. So if you've got a 12-week lead time processor, you've got to pay 70% of that expensive component upfront. And then you pay the remainder when you take possession of the goods. Then let's say you put it on the water. So it takes another 4 weeks to go from the port of Yantian to the port of San Francisco, and then a couple of weeks to get to retail and sold. And then your terms with the retailer are net 120 days, meaning you don't get paid 120 days later.
Thank you, Target.
Yes, I mean, then you're looking at 6 months from when you have to write the check to when you get money, which means you need a lot more working capital, which is all money that's not going towards growing your team or building out marketing. And if you compare that with another scenario where you pay the factory 60 days after you take the goods and you've pre-sold your product, then same product, but much, much lower capital requirements. And
how do you, sorry to cut you off, but how do you think about the different strategies then of like that 60-day versus the 120? Like how do you navigate, you know, in that uncertainty?
Yeah, so that's where it comes down to really having these conversations with if you sell through a channel, you know, what the channel is, and also with your factory partner. ahead of time. Now, the more compelling product you have, the better terms you can get. Generally, if you're building a commodity or a Me Too or a completely unproven product, you're going to have a harder time getting better terms. But if you're building, a really hot product, then you can often use that to your advantage. The trick is that once you've agreed upon the terms, they're much harder to change later. So that's a key example of one of these early decisions that you have to know about. It can't be an unknown, and B, you got to get right up front.
Could you share about the early days? Roomba wasn't always Roomba, right? And iRobot was not iRobot. And so, I think that when the product is doing this, everyone wants to talk to you. And you're constantly going from, a small CM to maybe now Foxconn wants to help you build, or JBuild. But how, maybe just talking about the Roomba early days example of how did you try to get the best terms for cash flow? Because it seems like it was so critical to negotiate up front.
Yeah, so when we launched the first Roomba, we were 3 years late. So we had,
only three,
which on the scale of it wasn't, when I think about how hard it was, it doesn't seem that bad now. Although at the time it was pretty rough. So the thing I think we did right, maybe inadvertently, but we picked a great factory that really believed in the product and was willing to invest in us. Because generally, factories only make money when they're shipping product. They don't make much money on the NRE. So they were bought in, and we were in it together. And then it started taking off. And for the first 2 years, we literally just could not build the product fast enough. We had no legitimate competition. The product worked. It was at the right price point. The first Roomba was, only $200.
For consumer vacuum cleaner, all these things is incredible.
Yeah, and we had a $50 cost of goods sold, which is one of the key things. And that includes the packaging and the manual and all that stuff. So not bad
for
them. But yeah, I know when we sat down, because we were having cash flow problems, to negotiate with the factory, because it was a sole supplier, and I don't blame them, it was good business on their part, but they knew they had us, that we couldn't pick up and go someplace else, because they had the domain knowledge, the tools, all of the supply chain, which wasn't probably that transparent to us. So I just remember having like migraine headaches after spending 3 or 4 days negotiating with them and my assorted bosses, and they just weren't willing to budge. So what ultimately happened is we dual sourced, and then
between two factories.
We launched the next product with a different factory, and then we could build both products at the same time. So that instantly gave leverage.
Do you think that applies now? Like, as you think about like the current situation we live in, does that apply now for how you would advise kind of this dual sourcing strategy?
Yeah, what I would generally say is if you're building more than 100,000 product units, then you should dual source. Before COVID, my answer would always be no, just pick one factory, build the relationship with them. Because when you dual source, you're really building two separate products. You're going to have two different supply chains, two different teams, two different sets of POs. Like it gets at least twice as hard. But now, if you did dual source at a lower volume, you'd want to make sure that you're actually mitigating risk. So if your two factories are next to each other and owned by the same parent company, you're probably screwed up. But
you're saying Foxconn 1 and Foxconn 2 is not dual sourcing. If T-Gal owns all of them, I guess so.
Right. Yeah. So you'd want to be like, maybe we do most of it in China and then a little bit in Vietnam. And often a good strategy is 80% in one and 20% in the other one.
Totally. So we have a question from the audience from Marco, and he's saying that the total cost of ownership model has been around for forever. But then when we get to times like this, we're not just talking cash flow, but you have to include tariffs, travel, energy costs, risk management, like all of these additional factors. Are there any good examples of, this for people that are doing it well that you say? So not just a concept on TCO, but, examples we can point to that, hey man, these companies really understand the full spectrum. Anything that you know of, Scott?
Just before you wade in there, Scott, I'm just going to give you a heads up that we're very close to the hour and we're going to kind of move things on and a couple of topics to cover before we close out. But
cool. So we'll take it as the last one.
Yeah, I'll just touch on it briefly, but I think generally much larger companies do a much better job of that. As a startup, at Dragon, we work with them of all sizes, so we get this, it's kind of an inside view. But at a startup, you're just so thankful the thing worked and people are buying it, and you might have product market fit, that generally you may not be able to dive as deep on the TCO. Where going back to sustainability, there are some analogies would be like a life cycle assessment. So looking at, what's the overall carbon footprint of building this thing.
Yeah.
But I think that's mostly in the domain of larger established companies that I wouldn't say have the luxury of doing it, but they know they have product market fit and they're building in a high enough volume to make it worth it.
So kind of modeling, if you want to look at TCO, modeling off larger companies that are more established as a good way to do that, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is if you're building 100 units and save $1, you've saved $100. If you're building 1 million units and save a penny, you've saved $10,000.
Exactly. Yeah, that's great. That's really awesome.
So that modeling is important. I'm gonna wrap you up, guys, here, because I know you could talk for a couple more hours, but I know everybody's got challenging issues in their supply chain that they've got to go and fix up. I would encourage those people to reach out to the panelists, reach out to any of us via LinkedIn or any other tools that you want to reach out to us. I don't know if we've got a poll to come up just to figure out what kind of topics you want us to discuss in future episodes of the Supply Chain Bunker. It will actually be sending out a survey after the event just to get some feedback on that. But we've had some great interaction here. Dave and Scott, some really interesting conversation. And actually, what we end up doing is we answer some questions, but we ask a whole lot more. We've got questions coming in about counterfeit components and how that's changing in the current marketplace and all kinds of other different things. So please share your feedback. Please let us know where you would like this to go. As Dave and I have said, this is the first shot. It's going to be very fluid. We hope we're going to be able to deliver something that's useful. Dave, you wanted to say?
And just to wrap up and close, a big thank you, Scott, for all your expertise and just sharing with everything. I learned something new every time we chat, so I really appreciate it. And I think that a big thank you to all the audience and stuff here. This is the concept behind the bunker, is to get all the experts together. And so the more that you can spread the word with other experts like yourself, to all the audience members as well as Scott, it will only enrich this conversation. So the purpose of this is to bring together everyone to a single bunker and have a fluid conversation around supply chain and how we can tackle this together. So I'll just say, be well, everyone, be safe, and stick together in this time.
And hey, Dave, how right were we about our selection of our first guest? We know.
I mean, couldn't have been better. So Scott, you make us all look good. So big thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, guys. This was a blast.
And let us know what you thought. Let us know if this time works for you. Let us know if there are any changes or adjustments you'd like to make. But in the meantime, thank you, everybody, and see you next week in the bunker.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Be well. Bye.